The gentle feel of elusive freedom finally caresses my skin. Like a lover's breath too many years out of my arms. And heaven's angels piss wet on my face.
Metropolis Lux Obscura is a bad game. Not only does it play at being a superficial knockoff of the Sin City films, but it's also harder and more frustrating than a match 3 puzzle game needs to be. I'm okay with games being difficult so long as there's a reward for toughing it out, but in the case of Metropolis, there's no pot of gold at the end of this hellish rainbow. Taking place in the gritty, slick streets of what I think is supposed to be New York or some similar analog, you'll spend this interactive story playing as John Lockhart. Newly released from prison after being framed for a crime, John tries to keep his head above water. However, when you live in a city where every bit of it is the bad part of town, you can see how easy it is for our hero, I use the term loosely, to fall back into his old violent ways. John ingratiates himself with all sorts of unsavory people to presumably find out who framed him, but weirdly enough the story peters out by the end. Or maybe it's because I stopped caring, because I've heard this story more than a dozen times. Metropolis operates under the assumption that Sin City is the final word in film noir, aping its excessive violence and gratuitous nudity without a second thought. It even goes as far as to name one of its supporting characters Goldie in a nod so hard I'm sure it needed a neck brace. John's escapades are presented through a motion comic with an art style that's reminiscent of Top Cow comics. Characters are drawn in a somewhat exaggerated style where men have big broad chests and gorilla-like arms, and women sport skinny waists and pronounced breasts. The game holds a misogynistic attitude towards women who are either strippers or high-priced escorts made to become sexual partners for the main character. They are also victims of lame, ham-fisted tropes that just don't go anywhere. An escort is suddenly revealed to be a single mother who does sex work to support her child, who's shown for a total of 3 seconds, and never again after that. One late-game character might as well be Ava Green from Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. Entire scenes are dedicated to getting women out of their clothes, and who cares if it doesn't make sense. Women are also forced to suffer through poorly animated sex scenes that are as erotic as watching grass grow. One scene in a strip club deserves the award for most unnecessary use of breast physics. When boobs are the only piece of animation in a motion comic, you know where the priorities lie. The only part of the game that displays equality among the sexes is the writing and voice acting. They're both terrible, and as emotionless and detached as any late-night skin flick. It's clear to me that Metropolis Lux Obscura is targeting a very specific audience, and while that's fine, the developers are well within their right to make the game they want, it's also incredibly lazy, and the hell yeah, boobs mentality just gets really old fast. But what about the gameplay? Is there something redeemable underneath the layer of groan-inducing schlock? Is there something here that's worth sitting through bad porn acting? No, not especially. There have been a few RPG-oriented match 3 games that do a good job of blending narrative and character interaction with the classic gameplay of Bejeweled. In that regard, Metropolis is pretty on point. When John encounters a bad guy, be it a surly bouncer or a mugger, the scene switches to a standard grid made up with different icons that deal damage to opponents if matched properly. Bonuses are given for building larger combos, though I found those fairly hard to come by. Icons bearing John's face boost his attack power by 0.25%, which is somewhat useful when going up against tough guys where every point of damage counts. On the punitive side of things, accidentally matching police badges will inflict damage, so you'll want to avoid those. Enemies attack either every turn or every second, third, or even fourth turn, and with the amount of damage they dish out, it always feels like you're going against the ropes, using turns to either heal or build up attack power. All this is pretty straightforward stuff, except for one noticeable difference. Metropolis forgot to make the whole thing even remotely fun. This is because the game's enemies are stronger and hit harder than you. Nearly every character I came across was capable of hitting me for anywhere between 18 to 25 points of damage, while I struggled to break double digits. As a result, I was forced to restart the encounter over and over until I was lucky enough to win. There's barely any strategy or skill involved when you're up against someone that can knock you down to a third of health after 2 rounds. I had hoped the passive perks you earn after every successful fight would make things easier and more manageable, but in the end they did little to make it not feel like you're trying to break down a brick wall with a carton of eggs. Success then is largely based on the luck of the draw, and boy, does that suck. If you're patient enough to replay these encounters until you beat them, you'll eventually be treated to one of the game's 4 endings. And in order to see all of them, you're going to have to restart the entire game from the beginning and, I don't know, change the order of the encounters? Metropolis doesn't telegraph the paths you need to take in order to view these specific endings, so really, your guess is as good as mine. In the end, the only thing Metropolis Lux Obscura is good at is making a case against itself. The story is bad, the treatment of women is questionable, the amount of attention paid to sex and violence is juvenile, and worst of all, it manages to suck the fun out of Match 3 puzzles. This is one of those games that's best to simply avoid and forget about.
Ow! Fuck, Goldie!
You, going to jail, leaving me alone in this godforsaken city.